2 days before Christmas in 1863, Ulysses S. Grant summoned William Tecumseh Sherman and several other officers to Nashville to plan their winter campaign in the South. After an unpleasant meeting with Andrew Johnson, the military governor of Tennessee, they returned to their headquarters, and the evening lay before them. I will let Major General Grenville Dodge tell the story. Sherman's first suggestion was that we should go to the theater. We were all dressed in our rough campaigning clothes. In fact, we had nothing else with us, as we had not been able to get any supplies since we left the Mississippi. That night, we found the principal opera house crowded with soldiers going to and returning from furloughs. We paid our way in and obtained seats in the front row, in the balcony. The play of Hamlet was upon the boards. You all know what a fine Shakespearean critic Sherman was. He sat alongside of me and soon commenced criticizing the play, earnestly protesting that it was being murdered and talking so loudly that everybody could hear him. He said, "Dodge, that is no way to play Hamlet." And he went on so excitedly that I said to him 2 or 3 times, "General, don't talk so loud. Some of the boys will discover us and there will be a scene." But he was so indignant at the butchery of the play that he could not keep still. We had entered late, and there soon came on the gravediggers scene where Hamlet picks up the skull of Yorick and soliloquizes upon it. The audience was perfectly still, endeavoring to comprehend the actor's words. When a soldier far back in the theater rose up and hallooed out at the top of his voice, "Say, pard, what is it, Yank or Reb?" The house appreciated the point and was instantly in an uproar. And Grant said, "We had better get out of here." We left, and no one knew that the 2 great soldiers of the age had been listening. I suppose I should mention that for a while my working title for this lecture was Yorick, Yank or Reb. I cite this anecdote not just because it is amusing or gives us a rare glimpse of Grant in retreat, but because the Nashville Hamlet illustrates some of the hazards of my topic tonight. The ubiquity of Shakespeare in 19th century American theaters, the sheer quantity and complexity of his work, the large population of his characters, and the frequent deployment of his language in the oratory of the age can sometimes make it seem that every actual person and every historical event is comparable to something encompassed in his works. Above all, there is the psychological verisimilitude of his characters, giving them a familiarity to us that suggests the prescience of their creator. As the poet James Russell Lowell wrote in 1868, "The more we have familiarized ourselves with the operations of our own consciousness, the more do we find in reading him that he has been beforehand with us, and that while we have been vainly endeavoring to find the door of his being, he has searched every nook and cranny of our own." Consider, for example, and now I will try to go to this. Consider, for example, that the play Hamlet features a play within a play known familiarly as The Mousetrap, that gets interrupted repeatedly by a series of bitter comments from an amateur critic in the audience, Hamlet himself, with his loud and disgusted laments at how poor the acting is, leading to the premature exit of several of its spectators, Claudius and the rest of the court. In his disruptive commentary, Sherman is to the play Hamlet in Nashville as the character Hamlet is to the Mousetrap. This is merely a circumstantial allusion, but the unnamed soldier's interjection is allusive in a somewhat different way, because it mimics the second most famous line in the play at the precise moment of its performance. "Whose was it?" says Hamlet. "What is it?" says the soldier. In asking for the skull to be identified, both highlight the leveling power of death, whether you were Alexander the Great, or the king's jester, or Yank, or Reb. And thus the soldier's remark effectively extends the graveyard scene into the audience, into that audience in particular, veteran soldiers who have no doubt spent their share of time in the digging of graves or observing that activity, or contemplating the remains of people they knew. No wonder, as General Dodge wryly put it, they appreciated the point. Sorry, I was supposed to do this full screen here. There we go. But that's not all the soldier has done, for in effect, he has also upstaged the play by reviving Yorick in his own person. Just as Hamlet fondly recalls the jester's flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar, the soldier's jibe sets the theater in an uproar. Before I go on to cast Dodge himself as Ophelia on the grounds that neither one can shut up their agitated, melancholic seatmate, I will simply note that some of the roles in Shakespeare's Hamlet seem at this moment fleetingly to have been redistributed among its Nashville spectators in 1863. Just as The Mousetrap dramatizes certain characters in the play world of its own courtly audience, Hamlet's father, Claudius, and Gertrude. As Dodge puts it, again using just the right terminology, there will be a scene, or more than one at the same time. As a brief footnote to this story, I might add that Grant, for his part, never confessed to seeing that terrible production of Hamlet. Nothing occurred at Nashville worthy of mention during the winter, he wrote much later in his memoirs, though he would approximate a line from Hamlet when describing a series of Union setbacks the following year. But misfortunes never come singly, he noted, in an oddly demilitarized paraphrase of Claudius's lament. When sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. This completes my specious recasting of the Nashville Hamlet, since if Sherman was channeling the Prince of Denmark in his behavior at the theater, and Dodge took Ophelia's part, and the soldier Yorick's, surely Grant has become the new Claudius, anxious to leave the performance before he is discovered. Tonight, I'll be offering a few more substantial examples of the way Shakespeare's works were deployed by Americans during the Civil War era, which is the actual title of this talk. I will start before the war with some instances of Shakespeare's language drafted into rhetorical service, and I will conclude with a drum roll of references to Macbeth in the wake of Lincoln's death in 1865, 156 years ago today. In most cases, I trust the allusions will be self-evident, in others, relatively obscure, and in a few, they might be considered personal hallucinations. In all cases, though, I hope they will be intriguingly debatable as to their meaning, and will challenge us to ask why these 19th century Americans referred not just to this author, but to this or that particular passage, character, or episode at that time of national crisis. First prize for zeal and density of Shakespeare allusion in the political writing of this era must, I think, go to William Seward, and it's not even close. On July 2nd, 1850, New York's ex-governor, now senator, and Lincoln's future Secretary of State detailed his opposition to Henry Clay's Compromise Bill. Building on his momentous higher law speech of 4 months earlier, Seward welcomes the prospective admission of new states, especially California with its recently discovered, but finds the bill's concessions to the South much too steep. New Mexico and Utah territories will have no restrictions on slavery. The fugitive slave law will be strengthened to benefit Southern planters. And though the slave trade is to be abolished in the District of Columbia, slavery itself will remain legal there. Given the variety of issues gathered under the Compromise Bill, Seward's response is necessarily somewhat miscellaneous. But Shakespeare is the main source of what is at least its rhetorical consistency. In a speech running 9.5 columns in the Congressional Globe, Seward packs in 22 references to Shakespeare. I've been to many lectures on Shakespeare that don't quote him as much as Seward does. On the left, at the in italics, Mr. President, is the first paragraph of Seward's address. If an alien in our land should chance to enter here during these high debates, he would ask whether California was a stranger and an enemy, or an unbidden and unwelcome intruder, or a fugitive, powerless and portionless, and therefore importunate, or an oppressor and scourge of mankind, and therefore hateful and dangerous. We should be obliged to answer no, California yielded to persuasion rather than to conquest. She has renounced her lineage, language, and ancient loyalty. She has brought us to the banks of streams which flow over precious sands, and at the base of mountains which yield massive gold. She delivers into our hand the key that unlocks the long coveted treasures of the Eastern world. California refuses only to let us buy and sell each other within her domain, so rich in all the elements of legitimate commerce. She invites us to forego an unjust, injurious, and inglorious dominion over a caste, and to extend the sway of peace, of arts, and of freedom over nations beyond the seas, still slumbering under the mingled reign of barbarian superstition and unalleviated despotism. The very head and front of her offending hath this extent, no more. The last sentence of this paragraph instantly constructs an analogy when we realize that every sentence in it could, with minor adjustments, have described either of those exotic outsiders, bringing their strengths, their resources, their very otherness to the wary host country they seek to join. I mean, of course, California and Othello. But Shakespeare's punchline is also Seward's plot twist. The quotation, which is down below with a little more context, comes from Othello's speech to the Venetian Senate, defending himself against the charges brought by Brabantio, the appalled father of the bride, Desdemona, who has just eloped with Othello. Some of Brabantio's accusations draw from the standard vocabulary of comic drama, where a deceived father, the senex or old man, laments the fact that his children have hearts, minds, and wills of their own. For example, pretty much every father in ancient Greek and Roman comedy and the Commedia dell'arte, and plenty in Shakespeare as well. But here Shakespeare has inflected Brabantio's version of the stock character with explicit racism, as we hear elsewhere in his reference to Othello's sooty bosom, his joining of Othello with bond slaves and pagans, his claim that Desdemona could not possibly go against all rules of nature and fall in love with what she feared to look on, unless the Moor, he cannot even speak Othello's name, has practiced some sinister black magic. The growing weight of these and other accusations within the play, added to the associations a 19th century American audience might have gained from the tradition of minstrel show parodies of Othello, could well have provoked the Brabantios of 1850 to consider a discomfiting analogy. Could it be that, as Othello is to Desdemona, so California is to the nation? Are they simply strangers or downright enemies? Are they here to defend or destroy? In Seward's cagily encoded terms, the statehood of California might herald an end to slavery itself. She invites us to forego an unjust, injurious, and inglorious dominion over a caste and extend the sway of freedom. Even more inflammatory to some listeners might be the more specific threat embodied by Shakespeare's most famous interracial couple. Namely, if to bring a free California into the Union is analogous to defending Othello's union with Desdemona, then the country will have committed a symbolic act of miscegenation, and not the kind approved by Southern slave owners. Seward's provocative allusion to Othello at the beginning of his speech is followed by snippets from Macbeth, The Tempest, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Troilus and Cressida, Cymbeline, The Tempest again, Hamlet, The Tempest again, one phrase from Romeo and Juliet, and another from The Tempest again, jammed together in an alliterative riot as he denounces the legislation under debate as, quote, the misshapen chaos of fair-seeming forms and mischiefs manifold. And you can see on the right that the first part of that phrase comes from Romeo and Juliet, and the second comes from The Tempest. At this point, we may feel that this bizarre phrase perfectly describes not just the Compromise Bill, but also Seward's Shakespeare mashup techniques. And we're only halfway through the speech, which goes on to offer two more quotations from Troilus and Cressida, alternating with oblique references to Julius Caesar and Richard III, followed by what I view as Seward's masterpiece, the transformation of the Wilmot proviso into a ghost, or to be precise, a body and a ghost. The body is Julius Caesar's, and the ghost is Hamlet's father. The Wilmot Proviso, named for Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot, had existed in various forms since 1846. While Wilmot's concerns had perhaps less to do with abolition and more to do with guaranteeing opportunities for free white labor, his legislation did seek to preempt slavery in territories taken from Mexico in the recent war, in effect preventing the extension of the Missouri Compromise westward beyond the Louisiana Purchase. Repeatedly passing the House and failing in the Senate, the proviso never became law, thus enabling Seward to present it as a restless, roaming spirit. You may slay the Wilmot Proviso in the Senate chamber, a glance at the location of Caesar's murder in Rome, and bury it beneath the Capitol today. The dead corse in complete steel, a line from Hamlet, will haunt your legislative halls tomorrow. Seward evidently became fond of this composite image, as he will continue to conjure it up in the Senate debates of 54, 56, and 58, thereby supporting his contention that the ghost would never rest. Here is what I call his variations on a theme by Shakespeare, and you can see that he begins to embroider the image with yet more snippets from the bard. I'm not going to go through everything, and you can consult this later, but he builds around the reference to the Hamlet's ghost stalking through the halls, puts more phrases in, adds a phrase from Comedy of Errors in 1858, and is generally all over the place. But too much is never enough. Seward immediately returns twice more to Troilus and Cressida, and then again to Measure for Measure and Othello, before concluding, improbably, with a line from the improbable conclusion of Cymbeline. The speech from which Seward quotes at the end of his oration is a comical bit of awkward face-saving by a Roman soothsayer named Philarmonus, who had a dream that he interpreted professionally to foretell a Roman victory over Britain. After the Romans lose, the previously misinformed Philarmonus revises his interpretation and now states that what his dream really meant was that there should be a reconciliation between the warring parties. It is in this generous spirit that he says, "The fingers of the powers above do tune the harmony of this peace." Appropriately modifying these lines into the conditional tense, Seward manages to bookend his speech with quotations from Shakespeare, so that the first paragraph and the last paragraph end with a citation. Seward's speech as a whole is long enough that all these allusions might not seem as manic as I may have made them sound, but it is an extraordinary performance. When asked later where one of his more obscure Shakespeare nuggets came from, I'll go back and show you that one. I think I skipped over it. These are consecutive paragraphs in Seward's speech on the left. And after he has done his Wilmot Proviso ghost move, he then says, when the strife is ended in the territories you now possess, it will be renewed on new fields, north as well as south, to fortify advantages gained or to retrieve losses incurred. For both of the parties well know that there is yet in that word hereafter. And that's one of two lines he cribs from Troilus and Cressida, as you can see on the right. When asked later where one of his more obscure Shakespeare nuggets came from, Seward replied in the manner of today's politicians striding toward the limo or the helicopter, "I have only time on my way to the cars to say that there is the secret of all my philosophy and happiness in that beautiful and forcible quotation from Shakespeare. There is yet in the word hereafter." Has anyone but William Seward ever seized on this line, which in its original context refers to sex, for such grand praise, I wonder? 10 years later, a somewhat better known speech by Shakespeare found its way into an important state paper when on December 3rd, 1860, the gratefully outgoing President James Buchanan sent his fourth and last State of the Union message to Congress. This was before they were spoken, they were sent as a message. After celebrating the general prosperity of the nation Buchanan addressed the most urgent issue of his presidency. Why is it then that discontent now so extensively prevails and the union of the states is threatened with destruction? In Buchanan's view, the answer is clear. Blame must surely fall upon, quote, the long continued and intemperate interference of the Northern people with the question of slavery in the Southern states. Because, again, quote, the incessant and violent agitation of the slavery question throughout the North for the last quarter of a century has at length produced its malign influence on the slaves and inspired them with vague notions of freedom that now provoke fears of servile insurrections. So wrote this Northern president with Southern sympathies. Several paragraphs on, Buchanan considers the founders' vision for their then new nation, and this passage is on the left. Its framers never intended to implant in its bosom the seeds of its own destruction, nor were they at its creation guilty of the absurdity of providing for its own dissolution. It was not intended by its framers to be the baseless fabric of a vision, which at the touch of the enchanter would vanish into thin air, but a substantial and mighty fabric capable of resisting the slow decay of time and of defying the storms of ages. In a document not elsewhere notable for much figurative language or for its time rhetorical flourish, Buchanan's second sentence here reaches for another level of discourse through a sustained allusion to the most famous speech in The Tempest, Prospero's somber elegy from the wedding mask scene of Act 4. Our revels now are ended. Our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air and thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. The allusion here stands out not just because the diction so closely tracks Prospero's language, but because the second sentence adds so little to the first. A hard-nosed editor, or even just someone grading an essay, might suggest striking it out as superfluous, yet another attempt at borrowed grandeur that is one of the usual functions of Shakespearean allusion. But Buchanan's use of the text may not be merely decorative, for it reaches beyond the speech to the surrounding context of the play. The unnamed enchanter is, of course, Prospero himself, whose touch has just destroyed the theatrical illusion of the mask performed by spirits at his command for the instruction and delight, or maybe just instruction, of Ferdinand and Miranda. And it is Prospero who will, in effect, destroy the illusion of the Tempest itself when Shakespeare's epilogue has the actor seek the audience's spell-breaking applause that will simultaneously set both Prospero and the actor free from the stage he calls this bare island. Moreover, Buchanan's references to time and storms, terms that are not used in the passage quoted, echo the play's very title. The word tempest derives from the Latin tempestas, referring to storms that occur at certain times of year, in turn derived, of course, from tempus, meaning time or season. I do not know if the word dissolution triggered a Shakespearean memory in Buchanan as he composed his annual message by its connection to dissolve, the main verb of the main clause of Prospero's speech. But that question matters less to me than the question of why Buchanan would go out of his way to allude to this play in so precise and sustained a manner less than 3 weeks before South Carolina begins to dissolve the Union. I believe the answer may be summarized in one word: slavery. Insurrections, servile and other, are at the heart of the play, and especially close to the experience of Prospero. The play shows numerous acts of rebellion, small and large, not to mention assassinations plotted, though none successful. It is from this context that Prospero's famous speech is so often torn and held up wistfully as one of Shakespeare's beauties, so that we tend to forget its origin in impatience, anger, and fear. He is, as he says, vexed and troubled, and his mind is beating at the recollection of, quote, that foul conspiracy of the beast Caliban and his confederates against my life. The minute of their plot is almost come. Prospero's fear of a slave insurrection by Caliban, with unsteady help from the drunkards Stefano and Trinculo, leads Ariel to please his master by luring them into the filthy mantled pool beyond your cell, there dancing up to the chins that the foul lake o'erstunk their feet. Following this, we have for Shakespeare an unusually detailed stage direction, and this is on your slide. A noise of hunters heard, enter diverse spirits in shape of dogs and hounds, hunting them about, Prospero and Ariel setting them on. Although the play is set on an imaginary Mediterranean island, it is hard to read this stage direction and not think of slaves in the Americas attempting to escape their masters, only to be pursued by dogs and hounds through swamps and rivers, and if captured, then tortured and or killed as punishment. The dog Ariel summons to chase Caliban, Stefano, and Trinculo is named Silver, connoting speed, but Prospero's dogs are named more forbiddingly: Mountain, Fury, Tyrant. Whether or not Buchanan consciously intended to cite The Tempest as an example of how wise governance involves eternal vigilance, especially against slaves who now want their freedom, the ironies generated by this allusion are thick and multiple, and largely depend on how one understands the politics of the play world and Prospero's role in it. To what extent was the America of 1860 like the island in The Tempest, with its many claimants, its many masters and slaves, where events, power struggles, and conflicting personalities and ideologies from long before continue to inform its politics? And perhaps Buchanan is projecting certain features of Prospero's situation onto himself, or vice versa, as he exits the political stage, though historians tend to agree he was no magician. As much recent criticism of the play has stressed, The Tempest profoundly, even prophetically, dramatizes the history of New World colonization and issues of slavery, sovereignty, and insurrection. Shakespeare did not live to see the results of the earliest European settlements in the New World, but this last of his plays, around 1611, suggests that he foresaw with devastating clarity what some of those results would be. Though miniaturized and displaced onto a fictional island in the Mediterranean, The Tempest's depictions of first contact, conquest, colonialism, rebellion, suppression, and master-slave relations are remarkably thorough and prescient. Though one of Shakespeare's shortest plays and grouped with the comedies in the first folio, I think The Tempest turns out to be a history play that will not end. Shakespeare was most valuable not just as a word hoard, an orator's handbook, or even as a psychology manual, but as an encyclopedia of characters and situations that could supply abundant analogies or partial analogies to people and issues of their own time. The two figures in the Civil War era who I think absorbed Shakespeare most deeply were Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, whose allusions suggest a purposeful appropriation of Shakespeare's language and a sharp awareness of the original context of the phrase or speech as it is now being reapplied. Both men came to Shakespeare along somewhat parallel tracks of self-education and what I assume was a growing sense of the potential of their own verbal gifts. Many of Herndon's witnesses attest to the younger Lincoln's interest in Shakespeare and of his friendship in the 1830s with the well-educated Jack Kelso. The first passage on this screen is directly from Herndon's notes, speaking when William Herndon gathered witnesses to construct his biography of Lincoln not long after Lincoln's death. He would receive letters, and he would also interview people in person. And according to Caleb Carman, who was around the New Salem area at the time, John A. Kelso, he was a schoolmaster, well-educated, loved Shakespeare and fishing above all other things. Abe loved Shakespeare, but not fishing. Still, Kelso would draw Abe. They used to sit at the bank of the river and quote Shakespeare, criticize one another. And Herndon himself said, and he had plenty of time to observe this, of his former law partner, that when young he read the Bible, and when of age, the latter book, he read Shakespeare. The latter book was scarcely ever out of his mind. Or hand, evidently. Lincoln's son Robert said that his father constantly carried around a volume of the plays through the White House. And by 1935, when it vanished into a private collection, the book was described as showing, quote, many signs of rough usage and is now in very poor condition. For Frederick Douglass, Shakespeare would have mattered in somewhat different ways, since knowledge of the bard was a byproduct of the more fundamental achievement of literacy per se. And Douglass's literacy was closely connected to the most urgent matter of all, his freedom. In a famous episode from his first autobiography, Douglass recalls the moment when his initially kindly mistress, Sophia Auld, was teaching the 12-year-old Fred to read. Seeing this, her husband Hugh rebuked her in language I will not use, adding, now if you teach him how to read, there will be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Douglass's second version of his autobiography, published 10 years later, My Bondage and My Freedom, gives Mr. Auld an additional comment. If you learn him now to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself. This phrase is so perfect that I'm more inclined to think Douglass wrote it as a playwright might, but whoever said it, it was pretty much true, since Douglass forged passes for himself and others in an early, though ultimately unsuccessful attempt to run away with himself. Thus, Douglass's mastery of Shakespeare was emblematic of self-mastery, of having no master, and so he put Shakespeare to work. Douglass felt that the election of Franklin Pierce in 1852, quote, revealed the extent to which slavery has shot its leprous distilment through the lifeblood of the nation. He viewed his own removal from a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland, to Baltimore, where he was in the Auld household, as an example of that, quote, divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we will. And later, planning an escape with some other men, Douglass found that the imagined fate of being caught and tortured or killed, quote, not unfrequently caused us to rather bear those ills we had than to fly to others, which we knew not of. All of those phrases were, of course, from Hamlet. In a letter to his former master, Douglass writes of his escape northward. I embraced the golden opportunity, took the morning tide at the flood, and a free man, young, active, and strong, is the result, concluding that for the continuing existence of slavery in his former state, it is not impossible that I might take up my abode there. It is not that I love Maryland less, but freedom more. The very next line in Brutus's oration from Julius Caesar, which Douglass has been citing, had you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves, and then that Caesar were dead to live all free men, is exactly pertinent to Douglass's point. He does not quote it. I think he does not need to. He just permits the Caesar who once owned him to hear the echo and to fill in the blank. In an odd circumstance, Douglass in 1860 would have found himself perhaps in agreement with James Buchanan as to the founder's vision of a durable nation. In a lecture he gave in Glasgow on the American Constitution and the slave, he posed the rhetorical question, what is the Constitution? But then he chose Hamlet, not the Tempest, to make the point. The Constitution, it is no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial something called, according to any man's fancy, now a weasel and now a whale, these two animals being among the choices Hamlet offers Polonius to describe yonder cloud. Douglas's interest in Shakespeare was lifelong. On the evening of December 19, 1877, he left his house in what is now Anacostia, the area of Washington, D.C., with its library of Shakespeare volumes and criticism, with its parlor fireplace, above which hung a portrait of Othello, there depicted on the screen, crib from the internet, obviously, telling his life story to Desdemona as Brabantio looks on. This, of course, is not a scene that the play depicts. This is a scene conjured by Othello's narrative in the speech we looked at the very beginning. Douglas stepped out of his house, headed to his local Shakespeare play reading group. The play that evening was The Merchant of Venice, and Frederick Douglass selected the role of Shylock. The ironies of this casting are wonderfully apt, rich and strange, but the one thing we can be sure of is that Frederick Douglass that evening would have spoken Shylock's lines in the trial scene when he hurls Christian hypocrisy back at the Venetian slave owners who ask him to show mercy to Antonio. You have among you many a purchased slave, much like your asses and your dogs and mules you use in abject and in slavish parts, because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free, marry them to your heirs. Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. Shylock's argument goes unanswered in the play. Some plays loomed large in the war years, not just by general fame and frequent staging, but specifically because they depicted a fractured country, suffering from what Henry IV terms civil butchery, and what Macbeth calls malice domestic. And who would know better than Macbeth about malice domestic? Lines, images, and episodes from Richard III, Julius Caesar, Henry IV Part I, and Hamlet had been regularly enlisted to argue the causes of a nation at war with itself. But there was one play in particular that would resonate uncannily through the events of April 1865, with the war's end and John Wilkes Booth's assassination of Lincoln, whose favorite play it was. I think nothing equals Macbeth, probably the least democratic thing Lincoln ever said. I think nothing equals Macbeth. It is wonderful. We do not know exactly when Lincoln first encountered the play, first began to be haunted by it. There is no excerpt in Scott's Lessons of Elocution, which is how many Americans at the time first met Shakespeare, and that would be as a speechwriter. Speeches were taken out of context and presented as models of oratory to follow. So he did not get it, Lincoln did not get it from one of his earliest textbooks. And we cannot securely place him at a performance until much later in life, 1863, when he saw Charlotte Cushman at Grover's National Theater in Washington, the other big theater apart from Ford's. Strangely appropriate that this bloodiest of plays should have been performed that evening to benefit the United States Sanitary Commission, a forerunner to the Red Cross. Nevertheless, to judge by the number of allusions Lincoln made to Macbeth, by my reckoning, more than to any play other than Hamlet, he knew the script well, and for a long time, using it with particular force in the great Peoria speech of 1854, where he warns, "In our greedy chase to make profit of the Negro, let us beware lest we, quote, cancel and tear to pieces even the white man's charter of freedom." The phrase comes from Act 3, Scene 2, when Macbeth asks for the arrival of night to conceal his deeds and nullify his conscience. That speech is on the upper left. Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender-eyed, pitiful day, and with thy bloody and invisible hand, cancel and tear to pieces that great bond which keeps me pale. A bit later, Lincoln returns to this passage in arguing against Stephen Douglas, the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and the doctrine of popular sovereignty that Douglas was employing to advance that bill. Lincoln's point here is that no matter how Douglas disguised it, the bill was designed to extend slavery, That such was the intention the world believed at the start and will continue to believe. This was the countenance of the thing, and both friends and enemies instantly recognized it as such. That countenance cannot now be changed by argument. You can as easily argue the color out of the Negro's skin. Like the bloody hand, you may wash it and wash it. The red witness of guilt still sticks and stares horribly at you. Here Lincoln uses the phrase bloody hand from the speech he had just quoted, then connects it to the more familiar sleepwalking scene and Lady Macbeth's futile hand washing, and finally conflates that image with Banquo's ghost, which is, after all, the one red witness of guilt who stares horribly at Macbeth, as he says in the banquet scene to the ghost that only he can see, hence horrible shadow, unreal mockery hence. The conceptual segues here among three scenes of the play are deep and intricate, as is the color scheme that results if we put the passages from Shakespeare and Lincoln side by side. The bloody hands of the murdering royal couple, the hand of night, which is both bloody and invisible, the invisible blood on the hands of Lady Macbeth, Macbeth's white face, bloodless with fear, the countenance of the thing, the color of a bondslave's skin, the bond that keeps Macbeth pale, the charter of white men's freedom. Lincoln's immediate point is that Douglas can no more make his argument than the Macbeths can remove their guilt. But the more fundamental claim is that the pigmentation of America is neither black nor white, but as long as the guilt of slavery stains the body politic indelibly red. What better bloodier play to cite to make this point? On this theme, here is a sketch, artist and date unknown, but presumably just before or during Lincoln's presidency. This is a tiny object. It's in the Folger Shakespeare Library. The Lady Macbeth figure, here labeled Columbia, attempts to wash her hands of slavery, while two figures labeled Lincoln and Greeley stand by in imitation of the doctor and gentlewoman of Act 5, Scene 1. For Lady Macbeth, the actual blood may have vanished long ago, but she can still see and even smell the stain of guilt on her hands. And scrawled beneath her, you can see the line, Lady Macbeth, yet here's a spot, out damn spot, out, I say. Finally getting some sleep in the early hours of April 2nd, 1865, after walking all evening on the deck of the River Queen, moored off of City Point, Virginia, Lincoln is reported to have dreamt he was in the White House and had been awakened by the sound of sobbing. Wandering through a gloomy hallway, he could hear grieving voices, but saw no one. Eventually, he became aware of a coffin placed in the East Room. In his dream, he asked a guard, "Who is dead in the White House?" and was told, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Over the next few days, Lincoln tours Petersburg and Richmond, now evacuated by the Confederacy. On April 7th, fleeing southward, Verena Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, wrote to her friend Mary Chestnut. The letter begins, "After life's fitful fever is o'er, I sleep well." It is difficult to tell if this is a claim of moral imperturbability or just stoicism born, as she wrote, out of the depths of my wretchedness. Either way, it comes from Macbeth. 2 days later, on the 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, while Lincoln travels by boat back to Washington with his family, some members of Congress, and a visiting Frenchman, the Marquis de Chambron, who gives the following account. As we were steaming up the Potomac that whole day, the conversation dwelt upon literary subjects. Mr. Lincoln read to us for several hours passages taken from Shakespeare. Most of these were from Macbeth, and in particular, the verses which follow Duncan's assassination. I cannot recall this reading without being awed at the remembrance. When Macbeth becomes king after the murder of Duncan, he falls a prey to the most horrible torments of mind. Either because he was struck by the weird beauty of these verses or from a vague presentiment coming over him, Mr. Lincoln paused here while reading and began to explain to us how true a description of the murderer that was when the dark deed achieved, its tortured perpetrator came to envy the sleep of his victim. And he read again over the same scene. Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst, nor steel nor poison, malice, domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further. On April 11th, Ward Layman, the president's bodyguard, claims that Lincoln confided his dream of the first of the month to him, saying, somehow the thing has got possession of me, and like Banquo's ghost, it will not down. 3 days later, Lincoln is murdered at Ford's Theater. The print on the left depicts the moment and captions it with 4 lines Macbeth speaks about Duncan before the murder. The broadside on the right quotes Macbeth's lines about Duncan after the murder, which are the lines Lincoln pondered when reading aloud on the River Queen to his guests, followed by the same lines used over on the left by the martyr of liberty. And then finished off with a pastiche of lines from the play spoken by Macbeth, Banquo, and Malcolm, with a couple of bits from Davenant's Restoration era revision of the play tossed in. And at the very bottom in fine print, you can see Shakespeare applied to our national bereavement. On April 15th, 1865, radical Republican Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio greeted Andrew Johnson, newly sworn in by Chief Justice Chase. I thank God you are here. Lincoln had too much of the milk of human kindness to deal with these damned rebels. Now they will be dealt with according to their deserts. 4 days later, in New York City, this whole assassination business was annoying the affluent, stiletto-tongued Maria Lydig Daley, who never much liked Lincoln or Lincoln's wife or Lincoln's generals or African Americans or abolitionists or almost anyone other than herself and her own evidently infallible husband. It will make a martyr of Abraham Lincoln, she wrote of Booth's act, whose death will make all the shortcomings of his life and presidential career forgotten in, as Shakespeare says, the deep damnation of his taking off. On the 22nd of April, hiding near the same stretch of the Potomac River where Lincoln read and reread those lines from Macbeth, John Wilkes Booth had resumed his journal by backdating an entry, and you can see this at the top on the right-hand side, from the 17th to April 14th, and then added the phrase, the Ides, legible at the upper right of the page. This is the first of several efforts to present his deed as that of a Brutus, a patriotic tyrant slayer who defends his country, a view endorsed by the composers of this song from 1868, showing Wilkes Booth as our Brutus. As his journal continues, however, another play begins to appear allusively. Tonight I try to escape these bloodhounds once more. I do not wish to shed a drop of blood, but I must fight the course. 'Tis all that's left me. These words are used by Macbeth, comparing himself to a baited bear tied to a stake, ready to fight the course of attacking English mastiffs, or in this case, Yankee bloodhounds. 2 days later, Booth wrote a sarcastic thank you letter to Richard Stewart, a cousin of Robert E. Lee, who had offered him merely a meal, but no shelter or medical care, and sent him on his way, well aware of the federal troops nearby. Again, Booth quotes Macbeth, "The sauce to meat is ceremony, meeting were bare without it," which is a line from Lady Macbeth's rebuke of her husband's failure to give the cheer. The feast is sold, that is not often vouched while 'tis a making, 'tis given with welcome. To feed were best at home, from thence the sauce to meat is ceremony, meeting the bear. Well, Booth then encloses $2.50 for his meal, redefining it as sold and therefore unwelcoming and bare. Not just Julius Caesar, but Macbeth seems very much on Booth's mind. Meanwhile, in England, the Confederate spy Belle Boyd, nicknamed the Cleopatra of the Secession, was about to publish her memoirs when Lincoln's murder necessitated the addition of a preface. Taking a page from her old nemesis, Seward, she piled together 3 quick Shakespearean references to the late president, again lamenting the deep damnation of his taking off, praising him for his putative treatment, future treatment of the South with an earthly power that shows likest gods when mercy seasons justice, that is Portia in Merchant of Venice, somewhat out of context, and deflecting blame from the Confederacy by proposing an investigation of Andrew Johnson, who, after all, received, quote, the benefit of his dying. That is Brutus in Julius Caesar, very far out of context. Well, Duncan may have been the main understudy for Lincoln in the 2 images we saw above and in the popular lamentations we were hearing. There is still another casting choice for Macbeth, and it is given expression by a man named Francis Hacker, a photographer and a Yankee whose illustration, The Assassin's Vision, is the final image I would like to show you. Here, a fleeing Booth drops his dagger when confronted by Lincoln's ghost, smiling austerely at his killer, just as Richard Burbage's Macbeth is said to have dropped his goblet on the Globe stage when confronted by Banquo's ghost at the disastrous banquet. Though Booth might have thought of himself as his country's Brutus, haunted by a tyrannical Caesar's ghost, this print more readily suggests that Booth is now Macbeth, as he was beginning to surmise the more newspapers he read while in hiding, and Lincoln is not Duncan, or not just Duncan, but Banquo, whose ghost, after all, makes one more appearance in the play when the witches grant Macbeth a final vision of Banquo's royal progeny extending many generations into the future, while the blood-boltered Banquo smiles and points at them for his. In Hacker's print, correspondingly, Booth must ride past not only Lincoln's ghost, but also through a forest whose branches swarm with several smaller Lincolns. And you can see the bigger ones behind Lincoln up above here. But if you get a magnifying glass, you can make out almost 20 little Lincoln heads. Here is a detail that makes it a little clearer what Booth is seeing as he rides away. Hacker's forest scene manages to represent not just Banquo's family tree, but Macbeth's other enemy, Malcolm, who orders that every soldier hew him down a bough as camouflage, so that Birnam Wood itself appears to move against Macbeth in fulfillment of one of the witch's riddling prophecies. And who poses those riddles? The floating arboreal heads in Hacker's picture may additionally recall the armed head, the bloodied child, the child crowned with a tree in his hand, all conjured out of the womb-like cauldron by the witch's diabolical midwifery. This is a weird picture, I grant, but it's no weirder than anything in Macbeth. And thus the fugitive Booth is brought to recognize that there is no escape, ultimately, from Lincoln's political legacy. It seems to stretch out, as Macbeth says, to the crack of doom. It will not down. This picture and my point about it are exceedingly trivial, given the magnitude of Shakespeare's artistic achievement in Macbeth. It is wonderful and full of wonders. More trivial still, given what happened at Ford's theater of war when the battle was lost and won, or depending on your point of view, won and lost. But such Shakespearean footnotes as these, I think, can provide some brief illuminations of that time, if only because the principal actors in our American tragedy were themselves so involved in the text of Macbeth. In this case, as elsewhere, I find that the most interesting allusions are those that bring with them not just words, images, or episodes untimely ripped from a source, but deeper impressionistic features of that source, some larger thematic or symbolic resonance, too like the spirit of the original to be ignored even in its new surroundings. Most allusions are invited guests and are therefore to be welcomed warmly, but the best ones are ghosts that crash the party, whether you can see them or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Really wonderful talk. I'm not sure whether you cast more light on the Civil War or on Shakespeare, but I think the point is that they really can cast light on each other, and so many of the characters in the Civil War. Okay, let's open it up for questions, and anybody want to ask Steve anything? Mitchell?
Yeah, hi. Could you talk a little more about that? You were saying the Ides, you know, and the reference to Brutus and Caesar. Was Caesar and Brutus, I mean, the whole, you know, obviously that play can be read differently in the political perspective. Was Julius Caesar the play, did that go beyond Booth in terms of, you know, seeing Lincoln in such a light, or the South seeing him in such a light, not just Booth personally? Was that like a political undercurrent at the time?
Yes, it very much was, I believe. And Booth, it's interesting to track Booth's own career on stage and whether he was influenced by by the roles he was in. But he very clearly fashioned himself as a Brutus, and he did it not just in that document, and not just, you know, as a pep talk to himself or something. It was how he had he'd apparently entrusted a friend with a letter that he wanted published after he had murdered Lincoln, if he had succeeded, which he did in doing. And the friend read it and was so appalled and disturbed by it, and didn't want to be found with it, that he destroyed it, and later sort of reconstituted it. But the point was, again, that Booth was modeling himself on a series of precedents. William Tell was another, a role he had played, and he was presenting himself as a freedom fighter for his region. And Sic semper tyrannis. I mean, he's trying to pull all of that, I think, as an endorsement. I also think I haven't come across anybody sort of speculated about this, but the fact that he brought a pistol and a knife to Ford's Theater, almost as a prop, I think. In other words, he needed a bloody knife to display, as if he were performing the scene of the assassination of Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's. The other irony, of course, is that the last time he really was on stage was in a benefit performance in New York City with his two brothers, Edwin, the more famous brother, and Junius Brutus Booth Jr. And it was a benefit performance to raise money to build the Shakespeare statue that is now in Central Park. John Wilkes Booth was vehemently pro-Confederate at that point, and he'd been working for the Confederacy more than for the stage. The older brothers supported Lincoln. Edwin Booth's first time he ever voted was for Lincoln. He was very proud of that. And it started a family argument between the brothers. But then the irony is that they didn't take the roles you might have expected them to. John Wilkes Booth played Antony, not one of the assassins, in other words. So it's hard. I think he convinced himself that he was acting according to the truest Republican principles and murdering the tyrant, and there's historical precedent for that, and he would perhaps achieve the fame that way. That was plainly a motive of his that he had not quite gotten on stage.
And you said his brother's middle name was Brutus?
Yes, this is very peculiar. So the great actor of the beginning of the 19th century was had come over from England, and that was Junius Brutus Booth Sr. And Junius Brutus Booth Sr. had many children, one too many, some of us feel, and Junius Brutus Booth Jr. was the eldest, and he was referred to as June. And I'm not sure whether that was short for Junius or Junior, but at any rate, Junius Brutus Booth Jr. Played Caesar, and Edwin Booth played Brutus, and John Wilkes Booth played Antony.
Any other questions? You can,
I see Joan Wah.
I can't see all of you, but you can, there's a way to, you can have the thing raise a hand. I did see Mercedes. I think you raised.
Yes, yes. Hi, Professor Dickey. I wanted to ask, I'm good, thank you. I wanted to ask you more if you could expand on how you said that there were models of oratory during that time, like Shakespeare monologues. So my question is, for example, would the common man understand all of the analogies that, say, Lincoln was using in a speech? How would the common man have understood all of these analogies that, like, Lincoln and other prestigious men were using in their speeches?
Right. That's a really good question. I think the straightest answer is the stage. That is where I don't know the numbers. I can't do the numbers, but I would say an enormous number of Americans got their Shakespeare from the stage. Now, when we say that, we also might want to adjust for what kind of Shakespeare they're seeing. Like, did they see it in Nashville, or did they see it in a highly professional performance somewhere else? And also the text changes over time, often radically. Some of these plays were completely, well, Macbeth is a great example, revamped and rewritten in the Restoration. And even though later generations of actors were tried to go back to the original texts, they didn't always know what they were. And then the text would accrete barnacle-like additions that would never be scraped off. And so you're still seeing Davenant's lines from his Macbeth on that poster for Lincoln. But I think the quick answer is a lot of Americans knew their Shakespeare, and they knew it from the theater. And they may not even have been literate. There was a very poignant story that when I was working on that library exhibition downtown for Shakespeare's the so-called death-iversary of Shakespeare 400, we came across a story about a miner who had ordered a complete work of Shakespeare. I guess Amazon was around then or something, but he had it delivered by Pony Express to him out west. And then he hired a young guy he knew who could read to read it to him. He bought the book, but could not himself read it. But he knew it was Shakespeare, and he wanted that. So there was an enormous popularity, I think, there. And then there are legends, and who knows how much credence to put in this, but mining camps, all the tours of the mining camps by actors in the 50s, especially in the 1850s, and that's where young Edwin Booth got his start, correcting the actors, because the miners knew the lines better, or they thought they did, and they would express themselves that way.
Thank you.
I'll say that I'm sorry. Did you want to follow up, Mercedes?
Oh no, I thought that was interesting. It kind of reminds me of, like, back when, Beowulf was like the oral tradition. Even if people didn't know, how to read or anything, they could still understand by, hearing it orally, just like people during the Civil War era. They might not have been literate, but they could still understand Shakespeare and know it was Shakespeare just by word of mouth. So that was cool. Thank you.
Sure. I must say that I have a feeling I might have preferred the Nashville production. Current day Shakespeare productions one sees, including at the most prestigious Shakespeare theaters. And one other point on that, I think that in all past times, including the mid-19th century, probably people were just better at remembering the words that they heard. I know that in Shakespeare, or at least I've been told that in Shakespeare's day, people didn't say they were going to see a play, they went to hear a play. And I think that our modern education system, which has many virtues, but it's not as good, I think, as the older systems in training people to just remember language, remember words that have been used, so that I think, as you said, people were familiar with Shakespeare at that time, maybe more than the average person is today, but also would just be more likely, I think, to recognize the specific language than people, might today, even with a fair familiarity with one of the plays. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question, Daniel.
Okay, who is that speaking?
The discussion of the references to Shakespeare, the use of the term allusions, I wonder if that's an accurate term in this context. I think of an allusion as a intentional and intended to be recognizable reference to this exterior source, where it seems to me that these public speakers were using the language because it was eloquent, direct, and it made their point. And that leads me to this question. To what extent was Shakespeare part of the educational curricula of public, private, educational institutions during this Lincoln period?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a superb question. To the first point about what an allusion is or isn't, that sort of meshes with what we were just saying too. In other words, to me, the phrase Seward is the test case in a way. I mean, there's all these phrases in Shakespeare in the Seward speech, and apart from the first one and the last one, they seem not really moored to anything that we're supposed to, some larger context that we can work with, unlike, say, the interesting fact of the Tempest showing up in Buchanan and so on. And I think I'm using allusion just sort of to cover all of it. Quotation is one thing. Not the other fact is, when the printed up, none of the Shakespeare quotations in Seward's speech were in quotation marks, or maybe two of them were in quotation marks. But when he quotes the Bible, or when he quotes Milton, or Las Casas, or Algernon Sidney, or all the other figures he brings in, they are either named as the source of that phrase, or placed in quotation marks. So it's again sort of, Shakespeare is sort of in the language, needs no introduction. We do know from Seward's journals that Seward was highly and formally educated, and he clearly knew a fair bit of Shakespeare from his college curriculum. I don't know what he may have read in elementary school, but Shakespeare was, again, I think, available more through the stage. And then the home, if your home had a copy of it, than in formal schooling at that point, although you can find him here and there.
I see that John Briggs has his automated hand up. John, it's good to see you here. As Stephen probably knows, but most of you probably don't, John wrote a book about Lincoln's pre-presidential speeches, a particular strength of which is the identification and comment on Lincoln allusions. So John, go ahead.
Stephen, thank you.
Hi, John.
It's been a while since we've had a chance.
Yes, we had it in the Folger reading room last time, I think.
Yeah, it's there's so much here. Of course, Tocqueville observed Bibles and complete works of Shakespeare in log cabins everywhere, he said. So we're talking about the 1830s. there. That's a remarkable observation. He traveled a lot. But my question, I have always been fascinated by the scene you describe of Lincoln returning from Richmond, steaming up the Potomac, reading from Macbeth, and reading the passage about Macbeth's description of what it's like not to be able to sleep. Lincoln himself, as you mentioned, is not able to sleep. He has just been to the Capitol. The war is on the verge of ending, and he has been where the Confederate leader lived and ruled. And I've always wondered, this is just an open question for me, I'd be interested in what you think, that among other things, he may be certainly thinking about the possibility of assassination himself as his dream, but is he possibly also identifying with Macbeth in somehow? I mean, he had such a commodious mind. Do you think that's also possible? This is kind of the opposite of the previous question, because it's saying the allusion keeps generating meaning when Lincoln is doing it.
Yeah, well, I think it's in the ear of the listener or something. But I think that is something one has to say about Macbeth, the character in general. I mean, why do we have any interest in this figure if you look at his resume? What is attractive here? What do I want to learn from this thug? But it's the extraordinary language Macbeth is given, and and I think that was, of course, one thing Lincoln said. You know, he claimed not to care much about the theater or seeing it performed. For him, as far as Shakespeare went, the thought suffices. He could be quite happy carrying around that battered volume of Macbeth or the whole play. But I think absolutely Lincoln is identifying with at least some parts of Macbeth, and I don't deny that some of that would be a feeling of guilt about all the death. I think that shows up in his preference. This is a lot of what John and I are talking about comes from a single letter, really, that Lincoln wrote to an actor very generously and listing the plays of Shakespeare he'd read. And that's where he says, I think nothing equals Macbeth. And he also confides in Hackett, the actor, that in his favorite soliloquy in Hamlet is not the one preferred by you members of the profession, which is to be or not to be, which is everybody's, in the top 10, but Claudius's speech when Claudius attempts to pray for the guilt of his brother, from which he gained the crown and the queen, and he cannot give those up. And so he realizes his prayers are futile. They're not going anywhere. He's on his knees, but that's all. And Lincoln is drawn to that soliloquy also, in particular. And I think, I'm also struck by the fact that that's a scene in which Claudius is kneeling and there is a potential assassin right behind him. And I'm assuming Lincoln, he was shot at after all. I mean, he did know that he was a marked man. And yet there's a sort of poignant, the weariness of Lincoln and the weariness of Macbeth in their exhaustion and at least an implicit kind of feeling of guilt that Lincoln has, envying death. I did have a part in this talk that I tossed out. It was long enough, I think we can agree, but the number of times I came across the phrase, "'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished," to describe the speaker's enthusiasm for anything but death, right? But the original context of the line is is Hamlet's wishing for quiescence, wishing to be out of life and not having to deal with everything that surrounds him. But this is the adaptability of the Shakespearean phrase, and this is partly a result of having, I think, having soliloquies pulled out of context and placed in textbooks and recited, and you were made to recite them and so on. But the ubiquity, I think it comes back to the ubiquity of Shakespeare. The Shakespearean universe allows anyone into it. Indeed, anyone who not even literate can get into it, and certainly in the 19th century, with all the theater around. So I don't know. I'm just sort of dancing, I think, away from your question a little bit. But I absolutely agree that Lincoln feels very close, in a way, to the sensibility that is in Macbeth at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen, if, as I think you suggested is possible, Lincoln thought of Macbeth and himself in connection with simply all the deaths that were, caused by the war,
Mm-hmm.
One would think that the speech that Macbeth gives, which might be the most ghastly in the play, although there's a lot of competition for that, the most ghastly image in which he talks about, I've waded so far into this sea of blood that it's easier to go on than it is to turn back. Do you know whether Lincoln, either in his speeches or writings or anywhere else, ever alluded to that speech?
Nothing comes to mind. I have to look through my stash of notes. Yes, to return would be as tedious as to go o'er, right? I mean, the idea that it's become that is so appalling, as you say. I don't recall off the top of my head a Lincoln reference to that particular speech.
Stephen, if I could ask,
John?
There's a really interesting point in Douglas's writings, and I don't remember where it's in a speech. Well, frequently, if you look at all of Frederick Douglass's references to Shakespeare, the most common, I believe, is a reference to to Macbeth. It's Macbeth as Malcolm's forces are approaching, commanding that his banners be placed on the outer walls. Defiance. And my argument about this is that this is the moment when Douglas is freeing him, when Macbeth is freeing himself of the witches' predictions. This is now Macbeth alone. He's going to face his fate alone, heroically, however terrible he has been. It's fascinating to me that Douglas would keep using that phrase. It's throughout his works.
I will look for that. Thank you. I hadn't picked that up, nor have I read all of Frederick Douglass, but I will be looking at that. Thanks for the tip. Yeah, that's interesting. Because he's full of Hamlet and he's full of Julius Caesar, as was reflected in the bits I snagged.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Anyone else want to ask something? Oliver.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I have a question that's slightly.
I can hear too much.
But you're muted, Oliver.
No, I'm not.
No, now you
Sorry, it must have been my computer.
I know you don't stay muted for very long, Oliver.
No, I won't, I promise. It's slightly off the topic of the Civil War, but given that so many people understood, read and listened to Shakespeare, and my reference would be Mark Twain, which I'm sure Dan will be familiar with, the two wonderful con men who make up a marvelous parody of Shakespeare. So Twain's audience must have been familiar to enjoy the parody. I have sort of two questions. One is, apart from the younger Booth, were there any people in the Confederacy who also referenced Shakespeare, or were they all misreading Walter Scott? And my second question is, do you think there's an attempt here by using Shakespeare to establish an American identity linked but distinct from what people felt was the sort of the original, in inverted commas, identity of much of white Anglo America, and certainly actors who came in from the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was then, like Junius Brutus Bruce, and of course the Great Riot in Astor Place. That link and the attempt of American politicians to establish their own identity using the origin of Shakespeare. And I just want to point out that Junius Brutus Booth was a horrible man, a drunkard and a bigamist, and I have played him in a wonderful play by Jake Broder called Our American Hamlet, which I thoroughly recommend.
Oh, yes. Okay.
That's my question.
That's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
No, that's right. I think there was a fairly early effort to co-opt or claim or even assert impressionistically, but against fact, that Shakespeare really belongs here in America. That and James Fenimore Cooper says in the 1820s that the great author of America is Shakespeare. Shakespeare is the one, and certainly the main syllabus of American Romantic writers all are mindful of that. Melville, perhaps the most keenly, of the influence of Shakespeare and the sort of frightening dominance of Shakespeare. It's not all roses. The anxiety of influence, I guess one could say. But Twain is a marvelously interesting and enigmatic figure about, again, the so-called authorship controversy and so on. But I do think his spoof of the Prince and the Dauphin in their show along the river, it's not that far off from, I think, some of the Shakespeare that was available to Americans in that era. And I'm recalling an anecdote from Edwin Booth, when Edwin Booth was still getting started really in his career. He was not the supreme artist everyone viewed him as in the later part of the 19th century. He was playing I think he was playing Antonio in The Merchant of Venice, or Bassanio, I've forgotten which, but anyway, they are performing on a tobacco warehouse dock in Virginia. And they are on a tight schedule because the boat that they need to get comes not every hour, but maybe every day or every other day. And it's depending on the tide, and they've got to get to the next town because they promised to perform there. And they are, for whatever reason, they're behind schedule. And the stage manager, or the guy running the company, tells Edwin that he's got to wrap it up. And they haven't even got to the trial scene yet. And if you know The Merchant of Venice, the trial scene is, which in fact, my early Shakespeare class and I were working through the other day, is Act 4. And so in the need to hurry it up and end the play, Booth said in character to Shylock, "Well, I'll make you one more dicker. I'm going to give you 2 horses, a shotgun, and these barrels of fine tobacco here, if you let the merchant free." And Shylock, whoever was playing Shylock, knew they were under pressure too, and says, "It's a deal." And Portia comes out and leads a big cast dance that's, that to wrap it up, as the Elizabethans would put a jig on or something. And so all of this crazy stuff happens, but they end the play successfully in some form. And then they're back on the boat, because the boat, meanwhile, is pulled up and it's itching to go. And the captain of the boat turns to Booth and says, "Say, I didn't know this feller Shakespeare had such snap. There's really something in him. I want to go see." So at a certain moment, it almost doesn't matter. It seems like what you put on stage, if you label it Shakespeare, I guess. I don't know. But there's a huge range, and of course, this is a major thesis of the Lawrence Levine book, of Highbrow, Lowbrow. At what point does Shakespeare become elite? At what point does he get priced out of everyone's ability to see a performance? And I think he dates that. I think it's a little too precise, but sometime later in the 19th century. So I don't know. I do think working on that exhibition that I mentioned at the LA Public Library exposed me to the discovery, the Folger's discovery of evidence that the earliest folio, because Folger is obsessed with folios, of course, that it was not the first folio, but an Englishman who had emigrated to Virginia, named Dale was his last name, had an inventory in his library of a third folio, maybe. And that was in the 1600s. So that's the earliest we know about. But Shakespeare is popping up in all sorts of unexpected areas, including the very first printed image of Shakespeare. It's a drawing of his monument in Westminster Abbey. Was used. The very first printing of an image of Shakespeare in the U.S. or the colonies, rather, was to advertise a stationery store. He was a pitchman. That's Shakespeare for you, right? Buy paper from us, and you too can write write this way. I guess that was the subtext of it.
By our folios, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do think that this is not only, I mean, it's a lot of humor, but there's also the great tragedy, of course, that Edwin Booth's brother kills Lincoln, and that Edwin Booth himself saved Lincoln's son from death it's just the irony is remarkable.
It is one of those, I mean, there's so many ways in which, because I'm not, I'm an amateur at the history of this, but every now and then I feel like there really were only about 50 or 75 people at the time. They keep overlapping. There's General Sherman reminiscing about having been in his San Francisco days when he was not, when the Civil War wasn't yet going, and hearing and thrilling to hearing Edwin Booth. His Edwin Booth's voice coming out of the theater right across from where Sherman was staying in San Francisco. And it just keeps back and forth. So many lines crossing.
Thank you.
Okay, John O'Keefe. Yeah, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Professor, your lecture was wonderful tonight. And I certainly recall that great class I took as a senior scholar with you about 4 years ago.
Yes, I remember that.
And actually, I had you come and speak to our Rotary afterwards.
That's right.
But anyway, I was one or two of the senior scholars in your class, and there was about 70 or 80 seemingly freshmen or sophomores, mostly younger college students in your class. And I got to know several of them, and they were enjoying your class immensely. So I guess my question is, are more people, kids in college, taking Shakespeare, or is it going, what's the trend in studying Shakespeare and say liberal arts programs like UCLA has.
Why? Why do you have that?
Oh, I thought somebody else was going to answer that for me. I don't know.
We love it. We love it.
The people who love it, love it. I'm glad to say.
Oh, I loved it.
Thank you for that, Charlie. But I don't know. I also am ill-equipped to answer that because I've been on leave a lot this last year, and also Zoom is Zoom. So I think that's an influencer. I don't know which way it affects things, but I think it dampens it. It doesn't dampen my ardor to teach Shakespeare,
No.
but it's grueling. It's just more grueling. I now view a piece of chalk as like a magic wand. I mean, that's all you need, right? And now there's all these. I understand the value of it, and Dan was saying there are some advantages, right, to having we can all gather this way, but I find it harder to teach. I do. I can't speak for the students, but Shakespeare's. I'm not worried about him.
That's good.
I'm worried about the way I worry is with all the felt need to defend a liberal arts major or an English major specifically, and the feeling that you're constantly called upon to justify what you're doing in some economic way.
Yeah, I agree.
It can be done. I see my beloved friend Rob Watson here. He's very good on this theme, but it's just I think it shows up as an anxiety in the English department.
I bet it does.
Commencement comes around, and we have a guest speaker who is there to reassure the parents that their child has not made a terrible mistake becoming an English major, because here's somebody who made a lot of money doing whatever they did, and so it's okay. You can be an English major. But goodness, the students at UCLA are just so wonderful that I'm not really worried about it.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm glad I took your class in person as opposed to a Zoom class. So yeah, I wouldn't have enjoyed you without the chalk.
Chalk is important. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that every one of us who either teaches courses or takes courses would agree that it's a lot better to be in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? It's now getting on past 9, so maybe this is a good time to thank Stephen again for just a tremendously thoughtful and stimulating
oh my God.
two wonderful subjects, the Civil War and Shakespeare, and bring them together for us.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for inviting me. And I forgot to mention that I realized there was a lot of text on that PowerPoint, and so if anybody wants to have a copy of it, I can zip a PDF to you of the PowerPoint if you let me know. So let me now. Isn't there some sort of chat option? I could write my email address.
That's perfect.
I meant to do this earlier, actually. For anyone who's interested in following up, or if you have a question that you didn't get around to.
I would, yes.
That looks good.
Jim and Merle, you have a yellow hand. I don't know what that means. Is that something I'm supposed to respond to, or just did you like what's going on? Good. I think we all do.
I have a question for the group. When is Zoom going to introduce vulgar hand gestures instead of just everything is too positive here, right? Thumbs up and so on.
I think there is a thumbs down, isn't there? I don't know.
Is there?
But we could do without vulgar, I think.
I just
some of you, Stephen and I will see on Saturday as we discuss The Winter's Tale, not one of Shakespeare's best known plays, not one of his most obscure ones either, but one that I particularly like. And I think that'll be a really good discussion. And to all of you, have a great weekend. Thank you very much for being with us. And I hope I'll see you at CLAFI events, many of you in person, next fall.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Stephen, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.